Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
This week, we are bringing back our discussion on data security, and this will be part of our series that we started over the break on the Blue Security Podcast's maturity model. And, we talked about identity before, and this time we're going to be talking about data security. And of course, data security is top of mind for a lot of organizations today. It's something that Adam and I have recommended that people get started on. And so we have brought back our expert, Amren Gill, who Adam and I work with at Microsoft. And if you're familiar with our podcast, you know that Amren was on previously and talked about data security, but now we're going to go through this maturity model to kind of tell you where we think, and this is our opinions, this is not published anywhere, but based on our experience as people who interact with a lot of customers day to day, where we think you are in data security, if you're behind the curve, on track, or ahead of the curve. And so with that, Amren, in case the folks missed your first show when you were with us, if you could just give a brief introduction about yourself, and then we'll get into the show.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks both for having me back. I was honored to be getting the club to come back again. But yeah, Amren Gill, I'm a data security solution engineer at Microsoft. So that means I specialize deeply into all things Microsoft Purview. So presumably watching this podcast or listening to this podcast, you know what Purview is, but it's the tooling that covers data security, compliance, e-discovery, records management.
Very good. And so with that, when we talk about data security, there's going to be several different areas of data security that we touch on in this show. We're going to start with classification and identification.
And Andy, I see that we've written this. It's pretty vendor agnostic, right?
So
this isn't, even though all three of us work for Microsoft, this is written to really be vendor agnostic and more talk about capabilities than it's talking about features of products. However, I think we should just mention it anyways. All three of us do work for Microsoft. We're all in our field security sales business. However, we're doing this show outside of work on our own time. As we record this, it is Sunday morning, 9 a.m. Central Time, 7 a.m. Pacific Time, where Amren's at. So certainly we're doing this because we love it. These are the opinions of Adam, Andy, and Amren, and not necessarily those of Microsoft Corporation. So, we may talk purview, we may talk specific technology because it's what we know, but the maturity model is intended to be vendor agnostic and just talk more about capabilities than anything else. So with that, let's get to it.
Yeah, funny enough, when Amren made his notes, this was on a Microsoft computer, and Adam and I have mentioned it that by default now, it's secure by default. And so all of our documents are labeled confidential and Microsoft internal only just by default when you start up a Word document. And I was trying to transfer this to my personal OneNote for notes. And I was having a hard time because it was set to internal and it kept on asking me you don't have permissions, please request permissions. You haven't signed in with a M365 account. I was signing in with my personal outlook.com. And so, yeah,
always a great demo when the technology works as intended, right?
Yeah.
Data security works.
Yeah. So it is definitely, as I reviewed it, there was nothing even in here hardly mentioning Microsoft. So yeah, this intent is more about your journey in data security rather than a specific vendor. So with that, let's talk about classification and identification. When it comes to that, we have behind the curve, on track, and ahead of the curve. So Amren, in your opinion, based on these notes here and the show that we're talking about here, where do you see an organization, if we're talking behind the curve from that standpoint, and maybe define classification and identification to start with before we get into it, and then let's talk about it.
Yeah, sure. Before I start, it's working under the assumption that an organization is using Microsoft products somewhat, at least in a hybrid environment. They're not entirely on-prem. It's a whole other boat of behind the curve if you're kind of looking at that. But yeah, assuming that they're in some form of hybrid environment and they're using Microsoft technology, we typically see from an identification classification, identification is typically like the discovery of sensitive data, right? So knowing where your sensitive data is, and then classification, although there's a blend of terms in Purview, specifically classification means identification. But if we look at this from a technology agnostic perspective, classification typically revolves around applying those designations of classification, like public, like as you spoke about, Andy, our labels, public, confidential, highly confidential. So they fall into those buckets of how sensitive the data is, right? And then speaking about customers or what I see in the field, again, just my opinion of what I see of customers who are behind the curve, you see this, no reliable inventory of where sensitive data is, right? So you have this mass data sprawl constantly, right? Sensitive data is all over your environment, but not having a handle of knowing where that sensitive data is through technologies like in Microsoft, like data classification, to just scan repositories, scan users' mailboxes, right, OneDrives, to see where that sensitive data is. Not knowing where that data is you're definitely behind the curve if you're not proactively scanning and looking for where that sensitive data lives. And then secondly, even if you're past that point of not a reliable inventory of where the data is and you are scanning, when classification is optional or manual or inconsistent, right? So maybe sensitive data is defined and there's some tribal knowledge of what sensitive data means within your organization, or it's defined by policy, right? So we've got like a paper policy where you have like a policy document that says these data types fall under these categories, and as they become more sophisticated, they'll map to sensitivity labels, for example. Having that as manual or unsocialized amongst your organization, or users not really knowing what data types fall into what category, so they're uninformed or not well trained on what those data types are. Again, an organization is really behind the curve if you're not building that into your training, right? Socializing what those classification levels are so that users could then apply, for example, like the right labels, or they know how to handle the right data types when is contained within the sensitive data is contained, right? And then even the furthest end of that kind of going more extreme is you get customers who are just in denial, straight denial that they possess sensitive data, right? They're dismissive over the fact that no, we know that our users, we encourage no sensitive data in OneDrive, or these SharePoint sites don't have sensitive data in them, so we're not going to address that because they're in denial of sensitive data. That's again a very much of a behind the curve mentality. We need to assume that sensitive data can be anywhere and then scan and classify comprehensively. And then another one is, again, kind of flipping to slightly more mature, but still behind the curve, is shadow data stores, right? So things like personal drives, unsanctioned SaaS applications, just those common avenues that are untracked, or you assume there shouldn't be sensitive data in there, and you're not doing your due diligence in order to extend your outreach to the classification or the scanning of those repositories, because you assume that that's not what their business process is meant for, it's their business intention, so that the sensitive data doesn't exist in those locations, right? So again, it's kind of negligence of not comprehensively scanning your entire environment for where sensitive data could be. And then a lot of what I've incorporated into my notes as I was going through this is very much in the era of AI adoption. Top of mind for most customers right now is AI readiness as you move into, Copilot, like for example, or generative AI assistants, agentic era. No active monitoring across the organization of what AI apps are being used, what agents are being used, whether sensitive data is flowing in and out of those applications. If you're not doing that monitoring, not even necessarily blocking or preventative measures, but even monitoring of how sensitive data is flowing in and out of those AI applications and agents, and I would say you're behind the curve, because we have very easy technology that is, once you stand it up, you turn something on, and it does that monitoring for you, right? For example, with DSPM. So the fact that you have that telemetry there readily available and you have to turn something on, vast majority of customers are doing this already. So if you're not doing that, I would say you're probably behind the curve.
So Amren, first off, the last one, you talked about the no active monitoring. I see the customers who are most guilty of this are the ones who were the earliest to employ the ban hammer and just block stuff. They kind of feel like they whacked the first couple of moles down and they're like, mission accomplished, moving on to something else. And they're ignorant as to the shadow AI usage in their environment because they're not actively looking for it. They took this sledgehammer approach, thought they solved it and moved on. And yet there's actually a bigger problem there, because we see the proliferation of AI-enabled experiences, especially in shadow IT, shadow AI specifically. And we know from literal decades of experience that our users will find a way to be productive. And so if we're not empowering them to be productive, they'll go find other ways. They will always find a way around it. We talked about on the show, I have seen ads on Instagram where they're literally promoting running an app on your smartphone and setting it next to your PC while you're in, say, a Zoom meeting and listening to the entire meeting and then generating a transcript. So if your organization won't do it and you think, well, we have monitoring on our PCs, we have all this blocked, we have that blocked, people can still just put a phone next to their computer when they work from home and listen to it all and then go put it somewhere else. So if you're not providing those and you think blocking is sufficient, you're sorely mistaken. Users are clever, developers are clever, and they're finding other ways around it. And then I did have a question too. As you were putting this together, Amren kind of put together most of these behind the curve, on track, ahead of the curve definitions. How do you define on track? Is on track what the majority of customers are doing? Or is it kind of an ideal on where you think at minimum most orgs should be, even if most of them are kind of behind the curve? Because as you went through behind the curve, here's why I'm asking. To me, that's most of my customers. They're all here in this behind the curve state. So it does not reflect, to me, a majority of where people are at. And I want to get your take on how you kind of broke these down, how you thought about it in your mind.
Yeah, great question. And it's a combination of both, right? So it's a combination of where customers aspire to be and where we're advising customers should be, right? The fact that we innovate so quickly and bring out technologies that cover these use cases and have been out for years, it really is almost inexcusable that these customers are highly utilized in our technology and they haven't deployed some of the features that have been out for years, right? I would say that's kind of definition of is behind the curve is, these features have been out for 4 years, 3 or 4 years. Sometimes, like AI stuff, kind of one year, year and a half,
almost
2 years.
A decade for some of this stuff, man. I was
even further, exactly. Yeah.
My first job at Microsoft was selling Azure Information Protection as a technical specialist in 2017. And I mean, so the basic classification, labeling, and protection, even some of the auto classification, or the basic rules-based classification, literally has been available since 2016, 2017, when Microsoft acquired Secure Islands a decade ago. So, this stuff is not new. It's not bleeding edge at this point. So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, yeah. And yeah, there's no excuse really to have a paper policy that defines what sensitive data is and then not have labels that are widely adopted within your organization, right? It's obviously a learning curve to socialize that and train users. But again, we're a classic example at Microsoft. We do that. We have 220,000 employees. If we can socialize it and train our users and get that to that point, then I think it's possible for any organization of any size.
You could, again, we say this all the time, not that Microsoft is the only way or the correct way, but to provide a reference point, you could show a document to most people at Microsoft and they could come to an agreement. Let's say you showed a document to 10 people. I bet you could get 8 of 10 or 9 of 10 to all point to it and say the same label. They would say, that's confidential, that's highly confidential. They would all agree on what it is because we have a very good mental model for it and we use it so, across the board now, we label by default that people have a really good sense of what confidential is, what highly confidential is. It's not hard to determine that for us. And that's because we've been doing it forever. Our management requires it and everyone's in the boat. Everyone is doing it. So you don't have different fiefdoms, different silos where their managers have kind of brushed it off. Like it is a requirement to work there is you need to be in the boat on data classification.
Yeah. I want to just kind of hammer in on a specific point that you talked about, Adam, which is most organizations think about data security in the fact that I'm just going to take the band hammer and block, this SaaS app. Like we don't use Dropbox. I'm going to block Dropbox.com. I know we're going to get into DLP later, but when we talk about classification, identification, this is kind of a key dichotomy of how Microsoft does security, data security versus how traditional folks, and I've gotten these questions in the field where, how do I block this? How do I block this? And that's like the first question that a lot of kind of legacy security people think about. And the difference is that we, as part of the Purview tools, we label and encrypt. So when we talk about like classification, the reason why I couldn't transfer that document, because the document itself was just classified as confidential. And that meant that document was encrypted. And so like when we talk about the language of security professionals, that document was encrypted with a key that was escrowed with my Microsoft.com identity, right? And so I would have to authenticate to that identity in order to unlock that, that document on a different computer. And that
And satisfy conditional access requirements too.
everything is part of authentication, right? Not only MFA, but also managed device, everything. Like we have all the things when it comes to authenticating.
Just to get that key, you need to sign in with phish-resistant MFA. You need to be using a managed device that is compliant with the Intune policy. It needs to be low risk from a sign-in risk, from a device risk, from a user risk for that sign-in to proceed for you to get that key. So it's not just, I have username, password, I can unlock this document. All of these things have to be true for you to get there. And that's how all these building blocks build on top of each other. Even data security doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in concert with identity. And if you have strong identity, it improves the strength of your data security.
Yeah. And that encryption, that label, once you've labeled it, like I talked about and demonstrated, it travels with the file. Like if I copied that file from my corporate device, which I was on an AVD on my personal device, we allow cut and paste between AVD and the host. But as soon as I try to transfer that to my host machine, which is a personal machine, it prompted me for credentials. And that's how like purview policies work too. Like when you go in there, it's very granular. Like you can allow offline access, which means that you don't have to authenticate for a certain period of time, or you can force it to authenticate every single time, which again, as Adam explained, it's all the things that trigger as soon as you have to authenticate. And so that's the key differentiation of how we think of data security versus how like traditional people have thought of it. That the knee-jerk reaction is to let's block this new thing. But if you are doing it correctly, that data security, no matter what new thing comes out, it's already protected, if that makes sense.
Well, I just wanted to make one final point, closing the loop on what you said, Andy. You're talking about that traditional thought process. And so many come to us, and the first thing they want to talk about is data loss prevention, because data loss prevention is like the bouncer sitting at the door, the entrance or the exit, preventing data from crossing that boundary. That's how we think about it. But that's only one layer in it. And notice how it's not even the first thing we talked about. First thing we're talking about is identification and classification, knowing your data and how sensitive it is before we can make any decisions about what we're going to do with it. So, Amren, we got to get back to you, man. We brought you on the show for a reason. If you have any final thoughts on behind the curve before we move to on track for identification and classification.
Well, the only one is to double down on what you said, Adam, about the initial block everything scenario, right? So it's actually a behind the curve point on having the DLP section, which is administrators kind of working under what's the minimum that I can allow versus how do I enable the business, right? And so much of that is actually blended into all of the behind the section. So I think you nailed it with that point. It's about that mindset of rather than just blocking everything I can, it's enabling the business, right? And that kind of brings me nicely onto the on-track stuff for classification identification, because again, another point you made is that we do a great job of socializing classification levels at Microsoft, right? So massively on track, or where I can ask a place that customers aspire to be, or what we're advising, or what I'm seeing a lot in the field right now is having some standardized classification policy, right? A mapping between that paper policy and technology, right? So you have your labels, right? So you have your public, internal, confidential, highly confidential, for example, right? And then again, what separates the blend between behind the curve and on track is default labels. So having default labels, maybe right now without encryption, it's still around getting users to that point where, Adam, you said they know what classification level should be applied to their data. And then the default labels or mandatory labels is forcing users to at least be conscious of the fact that I have to assign a designation to this. It makes them think more about what level they should be applying to that file, right? That certainly works from a tagging, a classification of items, I would call them, right, files and emails. But on track, again, if you'd asked me this a year or two ago, I would definitely seen a progression of this, but custom identifiers, right? So moving past the standard, like out of the box, PII, standard sensitive information types we spoke about in our last show, out of the box ones that Microsoft provide, but customers creating their own identifiers, right? So looking for their own IP, right? Looking for those edge cases that maybe we don't cover with our hundreds of out-of-the-box information types. The crown jewel data, business-specific data, that's on track. Right? You really should be looking for that 5 to 10, maybe 15, 20% of data that isn't covered by our out-of-the-box stuff. Probably is likely the most important data you in your environment, right? Your IP. So definitely on track if you're doing that. And then maybe I definitely see this as well. More recently, in the last 12 to 18 months, is that introducing encryption, right? Introducing encryption to the highest level of sensitivity. We are definitely in the boat of I'll go through in the ahead of the curve is default encryption, which you guys experience firsthand. But I wouldn't say that's on track yet. We really very recently, since SFI, the Secure Future Initiative came out with this whole default encrypted by default workflow. So I wouldn't say you're behind the curve if you're not doing default encryption, but at least applying some encryption access control, as you mentioned, to your most restricted data. So you're building layered security. So on top of that, you have DLP that prevents that from being exfiltrated. But if it misses DLP, if it goes through DLP, the last line of defense is still protected through label. You have access control, so if it does fall into the wrong hands, or if it ends up on a personal device, for example, you are able to authenticate, at least confirm your most restricted data is protected. And this is maybe a contentious point amongst my SEs. I did put this out to my team for feedback, and we moved some things around based on what they'd seen. Auto labeling, right? So if you're doing client side and server side auto labeling, I would say you're on track. It's no longer ahead of the curve. Not necessary. It's been out for years. As I mentioned before, Adam, to your point, it's been out for a long time. There's really no excuse to, at least, of course, if you're licensed sufficiently for this, is kind of more some of the advanced features in the Purview suite. But if you're licensed for this and you're doing your own classification, you've built your own classifiers, identification, you're scanning where your sensitive content is, and you're confident that scanning is accurate, why not apply labels, apply protection, even if it doesn't apply encryption, apply the designation of that classification level, so that your downstream controls like DLP that prevent restricted, highly restricted content being uploaded to personal cloud, personal email, uploaded into AI applications, prevent them from doing that with that connection between, by applying labels automatically from that identification piece, you're more protected, right? It's just bolstering that layered security by using client-side labeling, which is, of course, when users are interacting with the files. Labels can be recommended to users, right? So you don't even have to go as far as the autonomy of labels being automatically applied, but recommending is still part of the education, guiding users to the right decision, right? That's on track. As well as server-side labeling, which is maybe slightly further ahead, which is data arrest, right? So retroactively scanning repositories and applying labels at mass without any user interaction to files that contain sensitive information, right? So I would definitely classify auto labeling as something, if you're on track, that's a great step in the right progress. And then another one is having data owners assigned to major systems. So basically, you know who is responsible for what. So making decisions about the data, right? So whether it be updating administrators when there are updates or new data types are introduced, or helping security or IT train advanced classification on what the data looks like. It's having established people who are champions of that type of data or that repository or that location, so that they're accountable for when new data types exist or show up. That's accounted for, right? Or they need to fall into a different level of categorization because the data has changed, whatever it is. You have those established data owners and they're responsible for their data, right? Because obviously IT or admins can't be responsible for knowing all data types across an organization. So you need to have people who are specific to that data and they can actually provide that information to IT and admins to correctly identify and classify that data. And then finally, again, on the AI readiness front is discovering oversharing risks, particularly in SharePoint. DSPM does a great job of this with a feature called data risk assessments, but some form of discovery, not necessarily remediation yet, but discovery of oversharing, right? So the biggest risk from an AI perspective that we've seen in the past 12 months or so, maybe even going back further than that when we introduced Copilot, is oversharing. These AI applications are going to surface, if they have access to your business data, they're going to surface data from all corners of your environment, right? If data is shared with everybody, they're going to have access to that. They may not have knowingly had access before, but Copilot may surface that. It's not going to create new access. It's just going to surface existing access. Oversharing concerns are top of mind, and at least doing something to address that, seeing whether sites or OneDrives that have sensitive data that are overshared, if you're doing some form of monitoring or assessments on that, I'd say you're on track and in a good position for securely deploying something like Copilot or AI.
Yeah, and just one point here real quick, and then we'll get into ahead of the curve, is that, you talked about security enabling the business, data security enabling the business. And so when we talk about auto labeling, um, one of the reasons why I was able to eventually copy the notes into my personal OneNote here is that we not only we do have that auto labeling secure by default and encryption and everything, but I was able to adjust the label on that document. And so I was able to downgrade the label to remove the encryption because I was able to see. And of course, like the first time I tried it, it didn't work. So I thought that maybe there was like a sensitive information type that it detected or something like that re-enabled the label. But I was able to eventually remove it. And, like Adam said, like we look at the document, we can kind of see that there's nothing sensitive in it. And so we're able to transfer that over. So that enabled me to do the thing that I need to do, which I think is really important, is provide those exceptions as we do in all of security.
And they generate audit logs that can be reviewed later. So anyone freaking out over that, certainly there's still exhaust coming off that as humans make decisions and override the machine decision. You can go audit and review that as necessary. It's good to empower your people, right? I mean, machines are great and they can do a great job with a lot of this, but ultimately that human review and allow humans to do what they need to do to get their work done. If there's a persistent problem there, that will come to light.
All right. And so now let's talk about the really cool futuristic stuff ahead of the curve here on classification and identification.
Yeah, and as I was going through this, I realized that we do a lot of this at Microsoft. And I was curious, as you did your identity maturity model, did you find that Microsoft were ahead of the curve with a lot of what we were doing as well?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when we're saying things like requiring fish resistant MFA for every user, that's ahead of the curve. That's where everyone should aspire to be, but I don't expect most orgs to have that today, but you should be working toward it.
It's good to know. We eat our own dog food, right? We get the fuss of the technology, but sometimes there are teething pains exactly like the labeling when we switch to default, encrypted by default, right? And that's one of the points I make is ahead of the curve is default secure by default, right? The whole secure by default initiative, default encryption, right? So one of the changes that we made pretty recently was as part of the secure future initiative was secure by default. So now by default, as you mentioned, Andy, in your use case with my notes, is that our data is encrypted to Microsoft employees by default. There were initial teething pains, right? I remember as someone who's supposed to be an expert in MIP and encryption and labeling, I experienced that first time where I saved a file and I sent it to a customer of mine, and they said I couldn't access the file, and I was like, well, of course, yeah, I need to lower the sensitivity of the file. I was just so used to assuming that the default label was right, so it clearly worked. And this actually contradicts a mindset which has been in place for so many years. So when I was working for a partner beforehand, helping customers like operationalize Purview, it was very much in the mindset that senior leadership, CISOs, under the mindset of don't disrupt the end user, right? We want as few additional clicks for the user. We don't want any growing pains. We don't want the user to even realize what they're doing is impacted by what we're doing. And from a people perspective, that's true, but that isn't secure, the most secure way of operating, right? There needs to be some concession somewhere in order to be more secure. And we ripped the Band-Aid off with that. We said, okay, we're going to do secure by default. There might be a week or two of teething pains, but I'm just very rarely now do we encounter a scenario where it's not accounted for, or there's a workflow in place, or we're at least aware of the fact of what needs to be done to secure that. Right. So in an instant, your case, Andy, I would actually argue that that's poor on my part because I didn't change the classification level properly. You experienced that situation because I didn't label the data properly, right? Assuming that it wasn't going to, I didn't, for example, I maybe didn't know that it was going to be downloaded to your device, personal device, but it wasn't labeled correctly, right? And that's not a process issue, it's people issue. Okay, right. So again, secure by default, it's absolutely more secure and ahead of the curve if you're encrypting by default, which I'm not seeing a ton of yet, but certainly seeing that advised to people who are kind of in the early phases of MIP deployment today.
You earn the right to get there, though. That's the whole thing. You cannot go to secure by default out of the box. I'm not convinced of that yet. Maybe I will change my tune, because when you're first starting these deployments, you are trying to get people buy-in. You're trying to get process buy-in. It's very little a technology problem. And we've said that over and over. You're tired of hearing me say it. But showing up with such a strong-handed approach right away and disrupting so many workflows is a good way to have people start working around it. Same thing as we talked about deploying the ban hammer and just banning ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini. They're going to find a way around it. And that same approach. First, you need to get that buy-in on, hey, here's these labels. At first, no, we're just going to ask you to set one. And then we're going to start having a default, and it's not going to encrypt. And then over time, as we gain familiarity and everyone knows how to work with the tools, how to change labels, how to downgrade, how to upgrade, then we have earned the right, once we've built that muscle, to move to encrypted by default scenario, because everyone already knows how to manage that. When they did it at Microsoft, and you sent customer an email and with an attachment, and they came back and said, I can't open the attachment, you knew what to do. You may not have known, well, what happened? Why did that have a label assigned? But even people who are not technologists understood, okay, there was a label assigned to that. I'll just change the label and resend. You didn't have to teach that when that change went in, because that knowledge already existed. So there is part of that where you earn the right to get there by building all the building blocks up to that point. I don't think you can lead with that personally, my personal.
Yeah, and then the other thing too is that there are certain limitations to the secure by default, because we actually don't encrypt everything. And I'll use one example is email, right? Like we do not encrypt all of our email by default. We label it, I believe, with something, a label.
The general labels.
And there's probably some sort of auto labeling that happens if we type in something that is sensitive type or whatever, but we don't encrypt emails by default. And that would be, I think, a major disruption to business if you did that.
Actually, so interesting one. We must have had knowledge of DeepSeek before it was publicly announced. And DeepSeek, like the day it was announced, we hadn't updated our labels fast enough, used to trigger your email becoming labeled highly confidential automatically.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. I was talking to someone about DeepSeek like the day it was announced, and it kept flagging my email and saying, this needs to be highly confidential. DeepSeek is a highly confidential term. This is a public thing. Must not have been. And so someone somewhere must have set that up. So that was like interesting to discover.
Yeah. Great example. Yeah. So there are limitations. Like we don't use like by default end-to-end encryption on like Teams calls, and like our Teams chats aren't encrypted, I don't think, by default either. So there's limitations, but start somewhere and then do what I think makes sense for the business, right?
Yeah, great call out on the email. Definitely advised to encrypt your email by default. Okay, so moving through to then like what's ahead of the curve, right? And what do we see like newer technologies that can help with people who are already on track and they want to develop further or become more sophisticated? The top 5%, I would say, of what people are doing. First one is continuous and dynamic discovery using things like advanced classification, right? So trainable classifiers like building machine learning models, I spoke of that before, but connecting to structured data sets, third-party applications using things like exact data match, right? Dynamically looking for content so that as your other systems are kept up to date, so your classifiers, things like sensitive information types, regexes, keywords can become stale over time. But if you're dynamically looking for content connecting to other applications, third-party structured data sets, then you're dynamically looking for content. Keep your other systems up to date. That's going to flow into your M365 environment and beyond. And then again, that's what we call it, dynamically looking for content, right? As well as the proactive scanning, right? So we have this relatively new feature called an on-demand classification, which allows you to point the scanner, like the data classification service, to repositories and surface new sensitive data. So if you create, for example, an information type, brand new identifier in your environment, that newly created identifier won't have surfaced in all your existing data. So if you scan, then what we call proactive scanning, highly sensitive repositories, it will surface that newly created identifier, and then again, it's protected. Right? So performing that proactive scanning is definitely ahead of the curve, slowly starting to see customers adopt that proactive scanning approach. Another one is dynamic watermarking. Okay, so not seeing this used a ton yet, but I've seen loads of use cases for the need for it. So Adam, you mentioned before about the exfiltration, like the egress channel of someone recording the transcript, right? In a similar vein, not necessarily like the voice recording, but we always had that use case of, well, someone could just open it and take a picture of it. How do I prevent that scenario, right? dynamic watermarking was our answer to that, right? So that being a form of encryption based on the configuration, but when you open the file, watermarks the user's UPN and the timestamp when they open the file, right? So if you're most restricted, like highly sensitive content, if you're scared of people taking pictures as they leave, your departing employees, using dynamic watermarking is a great way to at least source where the leak came from. So yeah, that's another way, another thing I'm seeing that's ahead of the curve, again, in newer technology. I spoke about secure by default. Yeah, and okay, so here's a big one that I don't see used often. Very few use cases I've seen is content or conflict detection with regards to classification, like label mismatching. We actually have an audit log event that looks for mismatch properties. So alerting on this, or at least doing some review of your classification to see, like taking a sample, for example. I've seen this done with eDiscovery. I've seen people build their own applications, AI apps to do this, where you're doing some content discovery and then doing some assessment of, is this labeled correctly? You take a sample, and then the users who labeled that, maybe they really go through training, or you just correct that classification based on what you've seen. And then the two kind of last two joined together, which is performing some posture assessment, right? So we have obviously right now DSPM, which shows you the trends of how secure or how well your posture is evolving over time, right? So sensitive assets that are protected, exfiltration events of sensitive data, showing you where the gaps are. If you're performing some form of continuous assessment and improvement using a DSPM or your own tooling, I would say you're ahead of the curve, right? It's again of that relay of information of how well are your system working and looping back into developing those systems to make sure that you're at least improving your data security over time. We very recently announced 2 agents that are going to be released with Security Copilot, one of which being the data security triage agent, the other one being the data security posture agent. I'd say if you're using any form of agents or using these agents to help with streamlining the data security triage agent, streamlines the investigation for like IRM and DLP alerts, right? So it dismisses, using advanced analysis, dismisses noise or likely false positives and then highlights high risk alerts, again, reducing, it just streamlines that review process. If you're using some of those agents to streamline your data security investigations, I would say you're ahead of the curve massively, as well as the data security posture agent, right, which is natural language query to find risks that are present within your environment. So again, if you're moving with the technology and using agents and AI to discover and continuously improve your data security posture, then I would say you're ahead of the curve, as well as taking inventory of your agents and AI applications, right? So risk analysis, risk scoring. I'll go a little bit more into this when I talk about DLP. But again, using that risk analysis to decide, okay, which AI applications are risky, which agents are risky, using the AI to identify which ones are high risk. Maybe they need addressing, maybe we need to put more controls into those applications rather than just by name or knowledge of what the application is, right? Using the technology to assist with those decisions would definitely put you ahead of the curve. And then that's pretty much it.
All right. Well, let's talk about data loss prevention, which sometimes gets confused, with classification and identification. And that's really where data's crossing a boundary. Adam mentioned it earlier, like if you're transferring it, like what I did versus, like if you're transferring to USB or transferring to a SaaS app, all of that is where data is crossing a boundary. Copying, pasting could be considered crossing a boundary, right? And so these are policies that you have in place when that data is traversing to a different boundary. We have, again, behind the curve, on track, and ahead of the curve here. So when you see organizations on data loss prevention, Amren, what do you see when they're behind the curve?
Yeah, I would say broad access by default, right? So everyone has access to everything. DLP in monitor mode, right? They say you ask a customer, do you have DLP? They say, yes, we have DLP policies turned on, but they're not doing anything right now. Okay, that's pointless. It's not preventing anything, right? It's data loss prevention, not data loss monitoring. So if you're in the boat of having DLP policies deployed, but they're not doing anything, I would say you're definitely behind the curve, right? So I don't see many organizations like this anymore, but yeah, definitely if you're not performing any preventative measures of any sort, I would say it's definitely behind the curve, right? It makes exfiltration easy, right? Copy to cloud, copy to USB, through email. Exfiltration is easy because nothing is being blocked. It's just purely monitoring, right? The other one is, as I mentioned before, the doing what's the bare minimum I can allow versus proactively what can I do that enables the business. So the two of the big ones. And then just one final one to kind of touching on the on-track stuff is really technology specific. Great call out by one of my colleagues is the common misconception that MDE needs to be active mode to perform some form of endpoint DLP. This is a misconception that we've been addressing for years. I think most people are there now, but having another EDR solution other than MDE or having MDE, there is no requirement to have that in active mode to enforce endpoint DLP controls. And endpoint DLP is a linchpin of how we perform so much control on the endpoint, like upload to cloud, pasting into AI, a copy to USB, all of those endpoint scenarios can be performed with MDE passive mode. So I would say that if you still have that misconception that MD needs to be in active mode, that's a definitely behind the curve point as well.
Yeah, and Adam, correct me if I'm wrong here. I believe that you only need MDE P1 and onboard it to MDE in passive mode, right? Is that correct?
To do what?
To do endpoint DLP. I mean, obviously you have to have the DLP licensing, but I think you just need to have a license like MDE.
You don't need an MDE license at all.
Okay.
That's what Amren's saying.
Oh, okay.
You don't. Yeah, that's not a requirement. Right,
Perfect.
Amren?
Okay.
A service that is built into Windows that actually performs the blocking of like egress, like USB, for example.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, so you don't even need a license of MDE, and so whatever third-party EDR you have, you just need to.
Haven't they actually done some work to kind of break that apart too? Like from an agent perspective on the back end, like nothing nobody really needs to care about, but they've done some separation of duties, I think, as well. I don't know.
Makes sense.
Anyhow,
Makes sense if they have.
on Mac OS, they're definitely two different agents entirely.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. And so now, if we're looking at either where we see organizations or where organizations should aspire to be, like right now on track, where do you think we would look at an organization and be like, yeah, you're on track. These are the DLP policies we want to see.
Yeah, for a topic that's as vast as DLP, it's pretty straightforward actually. I would say if you have DLP policies that cover common egress channels, right? So email, sharing from SharePoint, OneDrive, upload or pasting into web upload, SaaS applications, sharing in AI. Those common channels, if you have some DLP controls that are at least blocking or performing some preventive measure of your highly sensitive data, you're on track, right? We see most customers in this bucket, or at least aspiring to be there. Again, DLP has been out for so long, there really is no excuse to not have those common egress channels at least protected for your most sensitive data. External sharing restrictions as well, right? So like layered security on top of the access control that you spoke about, Andy, before. For example, highly restrictive and restricted labeled content may have access control encryption on that already, but still blocking that from being uploaded into personal cloud or uploaded into AI applications. It may not have access to that once it's done, but if you restrict that, it does avoid a scenario where maybe, and for example, you're able to change a label, or so you're authorized to actually access it to change it, but for some reason there was a gap there, at least it stops that scenario because you have DLP, the layered security, that perimeter defense, right? I'd say as well, endpoint controls. So it's again, those common egress channels, just extending that to endpoint, right? So printing, removable media, all of those things are pretty common nowadays. I'd say if you're doing that, you're definitely on track. And then alerts are triaged as well with a defined response playbook, right? So naturally doing something with your alerts is on track. I'm sure that a lot of organizations deal with a ton of alerts, a lot of noise, but some well-defined process around triaging the most sensitive or the most high priority alerts. And I would say you're on track, and maybe aggregate them into Defender or put them in a SIEM of some sort. Doing something productive with those logs, with those alerts, would put you on track for sure.
Nice. And I'm sure you're going to talk about, it looks like this is more in the ahead of the curve where I see it now, leveraging like AI with those alerts, right? So maybe you can start with that, because I think I remember deploying DLP, years back at an organization, and there were just, so many alerts that it was impossible to triage any of them. And I think that many organizations might be in the same boat where it just becomes so overwhelming, kind of like a lot of like security signals to begin with, that there's so many that you don't do it. And so there aren't any like, productive alerts. It becomes just noise, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and there are a number of ways to do this, right? For example, like the the DLP alert triage agent that's built into Purview, to Security Copilot, right? It can do the heavy lifting for you, right? It does that analysis, it does the deeper analysis on all of the information, suppresses noise. You can obviously build your own agents to do that. We have another tool, which I mentioned at the end of the last podcast we did, the DSI, right, where it pulls the signals from multiple sources, the audit log, Purview, Defender, and aggregates those signals, vectorizes the results, so you can actually perform AI search on those to investigate the impact of a breach or an incident, right? If you're doing that deep like AI analysis and aggregating signals and streamlining investigation, you're definitely ahead of the curve to reduce that noise, as you mentioned. Definitely as well adaptive controls in order to reduce that noise in the first place, rather than keeping your policies as they are and then addressing the noise on the one end. If you go a step before that and make sure that your policies are only hitting on the scenarios that need to create alerts, using adaptive controls like insider risk management, again, using AI to control whether policies are applied to or who the policies are applied to in the first place, the scenarios the policies apply to, you're going to create less noise. You're going to have adaptive controls so that you're not, again, just doing bare minimum. You're only applying the DLP controls to a scenario where there is an elevated risk user, for example, by using insider risk management adaptive protection. You're dynamically looking for those scenarios that need restrictive controls. Therefore, you'll have less noise, more control because you're adaptively applying those protections. And then there's scenarios where maybe a user is departing and they're of higher risk because they suddenly start downloading a bunch of sensitive content. You have a DLP policy that suddenly kicks in, right? You're more protected as well as having less noise on the other end. And then another one I would say is, again, extending the DLP past those common egress channels, like into Fabric, SQL, registered cloud apps, and Caswell, registered and unregistered cloud apps. If you're extending past just like your SharePoint, Exchange, OneDrive, Teams, I would say you're ahead of the curve against some of the newer technology that we've been bringing out and extending to like the multi-cloud, right? Because obviously everyone's environments are much more evolved than just an M365 as they were for a long time ago. And then maybe the final point is using DLP to restrict, and this is more Microsoft specific, specifically Copilot bits, again, using the controls that you already have in place, like your information types and your labels, specifically labels, to prevent Copilot from reasoning over data, right? So you can actually say, this data is highly sensitive. I don't want Copilot to process this, right? Your most restricted data can actually be removed from the scope of Copilot if it has a specific label applied to it, right? So if you're doing that, using DLP to control what AI or Copilot can't access and reason over, then I would say you're ahead of the curve for sure.
Very cool. Okay, so lifecycle management.
Well, hold on. Before we move on,
Yeah.
I just have some real-time follow-up. So
Sure.
I did go review the documentation for endpoint DLP, and everything we said is right. To Amren's point, and we'll just say it again since it's a misconception, Defender for Endpoint does not need to be in active mode to enforce endpoint DLP policies. You can have it deployed in passive mode. It can work beautifully alongside other EDRs. However, you do not need to have already deployed MDE to use endpoint DLP, and you don't need a license. The cool thing is, if you deploy either one, it deploys the other one automatically since it's one and the same. So if you have a bunch of devices you've already deployed MDE on, there's no onboarding required to do endpoint DLP. You've already done the work. You're ready to go. Conversely, if you aren't using Defender for Endpoint today and you go deploy a bunch of stuff in endpoint DLP, you're ready to use Defender for Endpoint in the future if you ever choose to do so. So one onboarding handles both. There's no licensing requirement that you must have one to have the other. They're licensed independently, even though they share a common agent on Windows. And on Mac OS, they are different agents entirely. So all good there. Everything we said was spot on. So we can move on, but I just wanted to follow up on that.
Yeah, and but there's one other, I think it would be remiss if I didn't mention one other DLP scenario about the head of the curve, which is network DLP, right? Network DLP inspection, which is where we have that catch-all scenario where maybe like a user's downloading a third-party AI application to their desktop, right? And you can't but this isn't a registered application, it's not onboarded, it's not through the web. Having that network DLP, so for example, connecting to like a secure service edge, whether it be like Entra GSA or iBoss or Netscope, whatever it is, extending that DLP capabilities of like sensitive face types and labels to the network layer to catch all scenario. I'd say if you're doing that, you're definitely ahead of the curve and developing like a comprehensive data loss prevention strategy.
Nice. Okay, so lifecycle management also a very important part of data security, and that's really just about whether or not you're keeping data for periods of time. And I think when it comes to a lot of organizations, this is something that people don't think about, and it's super important for security because if the data isn't there and you don't need it anymore, then there's really nothing to steal or exfiltrate. And so let's talk about lifecycle management when it comes to data. Where do you think organizations are when they're behind the curve, on track, and ahead of the curve here?
Yeah, it's often overlooked because like records management or lifecycle management is sometimes handled by a different team, or it's not seen as direct impact on security, but definitely impacts, as you said, right? So that keep everything forever culture, no retention enforcement, they just keep everything. If we have it, then we have access to it. If we need it, then we have it. So mindset is definitely behind the curve, right? Having unknown copies and backups, stale data, orphan repositories grow unchecked over time. That stale, sensitive data creates risk, right? Sensitive data that's old and shouldn't be there unless it's kept there for some compliance or regulatory purpose, it should be deleted, right, after a certain time in a controlled manner, like securely deleted, defensively deleted. Not only because it increases the risk of holding that data when you don't need it, but also it impacts the accuracy and efficiency of AI, the effectiveness of AI. If AI is reasoning over data that's 10, 15 years old and that isn't relevant, then it's going to impact the results. It's going to impact the accuracy of how well the results are being returned. So there's multiple reasons as to why that data should be disposed of if it's not necessary. Another one is, which is also overlooked, is little control over test or dev environments, right? Use of production data in dev environments. When we're deploying this out, you're doing a POC, you're testing how the technology works. Obviously, you need to dispose or easily use dummy data, like masked data. Very often we see production data put into dev environments and it's not cleaned up, right? That data spreads to an environment which maybe isn't as secure as your prod environment. And then another one is the lack of alignment between business units, regions in accordance with regulatory requirements, right? So, as I kind of go to like the security is a team sport, right? So definitely behind the curve mentality is assuming that IT or security is responsible for security, not working together collaboratively to achieve those like regulatory compliance goals as an organization is definitely behind the curve.
Yeah, and then just one other point before we move on to on track is, not only is it a security thing, it also like affects your company legally, because if the data is there and you get sued and you have litigation, I mean, all that stuff is discoverable. Like I've seen companies where, people have just written whatever in emails, right? Like they're like unprofessional in emails, let's just say. And that becomes discoverable in court because you didn't have a retention schedule and you kept everything. And we don't use email the same way we do now that we did 10, 15 years ago. And if you kept all that, it can be quite an embarrassment for folks. Yep. Okay, so let's talk about on track.
So again, very much like DLP, it's quite straightforward. Obviously, very similar. People have settled on a position that they're pretty happy with what they're doing for now, and then some are pushing the boat out a little bit. But retention schedules defined for major systems, right? So saying Exchange gets retained for this long, and at the end of 5 years, 10 years, 7 years, it gets deleted, right? They have ability to apply one-off use cases. You have retention labels, so users can keep emails, specific emails or folders if they want to. But there's some disposal process that exists, right? Deletion based on it's 7 years old, 5 years old. And then you'll typically see different retention schedules for things like SharePoint having longer than like OneDrive, for example, Exchange having its own lifecycle as opposed to your Teams chats, right, being retained for much less time. So having some retention schedules in place actually puts you on track, at least what we're seeing in the middle in terms of that bell curve. And then again, as I mentioned before, that the test like dev environment using like synthetic data or at least doing some form of cleanup process around that after running things like POCs and pilots in those dev environments, those test environments, then I'd say you're on track. You're doing your due diligence to clean up that sensitive data sprawl outside of your environment. And then finally is to that last point I made on the behind the curve is a concerted effort to adhere to the evolving regulatory landscape across the organization, right? Using things like attributes in Entra, like for example, to give certain people from certain regions because they have they have to meet different regulatory requirements. So using attributes from Entra, for example, to apply different retention schedules to them, right? Adaptive scopes doing that. If you're doing that, let's say you're on track, at least accounting for those different scenarios to adhere to regulatory compliance. That maybe is a bit of a harsh one to say that's not ahead of the curve. But again, it's something that we're advising you should absolutely be doing because of the cost risks associated with non-compliance.
And just a couple examples real quick on how Microsoft does this. Like for teams, like they allow us to spin up any teams that we want, but you have to attest to that team. I can't remember the exact date, maybe like every 90 days or something like that. Otherwise the team gets deleted. And that's an M365 group that's done within Entra, I believe. But, that's just a way that if you have stale data in a team, which is a SharePoint site and all of that. So once the team gets deleted, all the data gets deleted as well. And then similarly with Teams recordings, we record a meeting that automatically has a retention label put on it as well. Again, I think it's 90 days. But like you said, Amren, we can go in and change that. So I can attest to a team that I created and say, yes, I'm still using it. I want to keep this. I can go in and change an individual recording to be longer or even never expire. But there are retention schedules defined, as you said, and that is where we think most organizations should be at today.
And the defaults, of course. Most people just roll with the defaults. I mean, Andy, you were just saying you can change, and I knew that conceptually. I don't even know where you go to do it because I've never even thought to try to retain a Teams transcript longer. Like the 90 days is fine. At that point, it's pretty stale. Like, get rid of it. We don't want it. It's risk. I love it. So I remember early in my career, we had a gentleman with an outsized Lotus Notes database compared to everyone else in the company. And he was named as a custodian in a lawsuit. And there was a lot of interesting messages in there that opposing counsel found very compelling. And so he became a believer very quickly in data lifecycle management after that. That's for sure. That gentleman got on board with, I don't want to hoard it anymore. Get rid of it.
Yep. Okay. So ahead of the curve on retention, where do we think?
Yeah, and it follows a similar trend to some of the classification stuff, right? It's again, leveraging autonomy to satisfy those edge cases, right? So automated data minimization is really the theme here. It's using your classifiers, by using those scenarios to automatically apply maybe longer retention because it contains health records or certain customer data, whatever it is. It contains secret data that needs to just be held for longer, retained for longer. It's addressing those edge use cases through automation, right? The retention, as well as maybe some of those other channels that I mentioned before, that continuous cleanup of data, right? The continuous cleanup workflows, stale permissions, right? Deprovisioning SharePoint sites, triggering access reviews, right? So we do that at Microsoft. If you own a SharePoint site, and as you said, we very much work under the workflow of encourage users to create teams and create new SharePoint sites and channels so they don't become stale, but we clean up the ones that we create previously, because I think it's like 90 days, you get an SharePoint access site review. Right, so it triggers a site review, you validate the membership, validate what the site's even needed. We encourage people to delete that and create new ones. Constant recycling of SharePoint sites, for example, is a great continuous cleanup workflow example. Another one is finely grained lifecycle controls, right? So like auto expire, auto archive, auto delete. If you're doing, again, addressing those edge cases rather than just what we call the big bucket approach we went through in the last podcast, like retention schedules set to entire workloads, then I would say you're ahead of the curve. And then again, last point, extension to AI. Again, if you're incorporating your prompts and responses and your AI interactions into your lifecycle management, I'd say you're ahead of the curve. It can very easily be a case of, okay, we've set our retention schedules, they map to our paper policy, we're going to leave it as is. And then as new technology comes out and the technology landscape evolves, you need to move with it, right? So you need to start incorporating things like chats. And when Teams came out, incorporate that, and you sort of start incorporating prompts and responses into your lifecycle management as well. If you're actively incorporating new technologies into your retention schedules, then I would say you're ahead of the curve there as well.
All right. Any final comments before we move on to our last topic here? All right. So people and culture. And I really like that you incorporated this into the whole discussion because I think oftentimes security, this being a security podcast, security folks, we may handle the tools. We may have access to the tools that are required to assist with data security, but we don't often know, all the people, all the processes, all the data that's involved. Like, how do I know what's important to legal and how do I know what's important to engineering? And so I think people and culture is an extremely important part of a data security initiative, a data security project. And so glad that you included this. We have, again, behind the curve, on track, and ahead of the curve. So where do you think organizations are when it comes to culture when they're behind the curve here?
And you raise a good point because it's often overlooked, and it's it's a cornerstone of how to do this successfully. Is you need to buy in from organization and your employees in order to make this stuff work. So the first one starts with training, right? So if you see training as a checkbox exercise, how to handle data, we mentioned it before, how to handle data, how to appropriately classify data. If it's just a checkbox exercise and you're involving just some mandatory learning done, but you're actually embedding that mindset into your employees, and I think you're set up for failure, right? You're definitely behind the curve if you're not incorporating that into some meaningful way. I would also say if things like exceptions, those edge cases that are handled with some of those more ahead of the curve scenario, they're not at least well documented, and I would say you're behind the curve there too, right? So you need that continuous improvement, is maybe skipping towards more of the ahead of the curve. But if you don't have those documented, then you can't relay that back into your processes and having continuous improvement, right? So if you're unaware of what those edge cases are, then and you're not taking feedback from your employees, then I would say you're behind the curve from a people and culture perspective as well. Another one is where security isn't viewed as shared accountability, right? I mentioned this before, where it's just seen as IT's job or just seen as security's job. That there's a disconnect between multiple teams, right? So the Defender suite as well as the Purview suite, they span multiple tools, multiple products, multiple workloads. And in order to comprehensively secure these, you need collaboration from multiple corners of the business, right? Security needs to be a team sport. And if you're not doing that, if you don't have some form of committee or champions throughout your organization to help build a security program, whether it's data security or cybersecurity, I think you're behind the curve there, right? You need to realize that it's a team sport.
Amren, on that one, I say this on the show all the time, but I'll say it again. I typically only fly on Delta Airlines, and so I practically have the safety briefing video memorized that they give at the start of the flight. But one of the things they say is safety is the number one priority on every Delta flight and the shared responsibility of everyone on board. And I love that. And I call that out every time this comes up because security is the same concept as that. Safety, if someone on the airplane is on fire and smoke is filling the cabin and is trying to get their carry-on out of the overhead bin and is slowing the evacuation, they can endanger everyone else at risk. It's a shared responsibility, right? When it comes to evacuating the plane, it's not just the responsibility of the flight attendants and the crew. Similarly with security, one person can undermine all the security work done. Security is a shared responsibility. So I love that call out. I have to highlight that one because I'm such a big fan of it.
That's a great analogy. It really does apply. You're only as strong as your weakest link, right? The other one, the last one, is again kind of in a similar vein, but it's generally like a similar of a senior leadership level. Is when senior leadership, C-suite boards don't involve CISOs into strategy planning, right? Because it's hard to quantify the benefit or like the return ROI of security because there isn't a dollar amount necessarily associated with it. Like you're reducing risk, right? You're preventing that hundreds of $millions or regulatory breach, the incident happening. Typically, it's not addressed in the same vein as some financial gain or some financial ROI or improvement of efficiency somewhere. So a bit definitely behind the curve mindset is not appreciating the value of security and not bringing in CISOs, for example, into those senior leadership, those strategy discussions. But I think we're definitely seeing customers move away from that, and that hasn't been the case for a long time. I think people understand the importance of security, but definitely behind the curve if that's happening in your organization.
Good. Okay. So let's move on to on track. Where do we see organizations should be today?
Yep. So again, on the training point first, right? Role-based training. So if you're a developer, if you're an analyst, if you're an HR, finance executives, having some custom role-based training based on what data they can handle, scenarios that they're going to encounter. This is pretty common. I think if you have that kind a specific training, a kind of role specific training, then you're on track and you're doing your due diligence to train people appropriately. And at least people switch off from training, they put on double speed, they put it on in the background and do something else. So if you can make your training engaging, or at least relevant to what they're doing, people are more likely to be engaged and more likely to learn. And of course, you're going to have a more secure culture across your environment in your organization, right? Again, clear handling standards, again, should be baked into your training, but clearly documenting. We do a great job of this. Like if you apply a sensitivity label in our environment, on the drop down, you hit learn more, it takes you to a landing page, which gives you all of the labels. It gives you the tree of the labels. It gives you exactly what control every single label does. It gives you a breakdown of definition of everything for what data should fall into those, right? And making that very clear for your users is very important. And if you're doing that, then I think you're on track as well. Metrics reported, right? So things like policy adoption, incident trends, high risk repositories, all of those things, if you're performing that metric adoption, if you're at least doing the analysis, not necessarily taking it and putting it back into continuous improvement, I'd say if you're doing that analysis, then I'd say you're on track. It can be a little bit difficult to take that and continuously improve and refine. Let's say maybe that's slightly more ahead of the curve. But if you're doing the metrics reporting, at least if you have the metrics there, I'd say you're on track as well. And then final point is a champions program, embedded security or privacy partners, right? So part of that team effort of security, and the security being a team sport, is having advocates across your organization. Typically, the enterprise organizations you work with are so big, it's very difficult to have some form of impact, or at least not have some disruption to business continuity, unless you have champions throughout the business who can advocate for what you're trying to do, as well as provide feedback so that you are doing it to empower the business, as opposed to being seen as a blocker because your security, the person who's putting that foot down and saying, no, you can't do something. And having those champions is really important. If you're doing that, then I would say you're on track.
Plus one to that last call out around the champions. This is something we use to great benefit. When I was in enterprise IT, we had what were called our super users, and they were throughout our organization. And anytime we wanted to roll out anything new or make a change, we could involve them in it, and they could help us validate. Yes, this breaks this application. No, our apps are working fine with this update. Having those champions throughout all of your organization, all the different apps and different workflows they use, being able to speak to them is really powerful. And it's an organization you should nurture and maintain over time, because having that line of communication to all your disparate folks and all the different functions they perform is valuable for every corner of IT and cybersecurity.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so our final one, ahead of the curve on people and culture here. Where do you think organizations can aspire to be?
Yeah, so I would say, again, is that people, process, technology combination, where if your security behaviors are reinforced by the tooling, right, that they work together, so that it's hard to do the wrong thing, right? It's difficult because of people not wanting to, people knowing that they shouldn't do it, and also the tooling backs that up, right? There's some cohesion between the tooling, the policy that you've enforced, working with the culture and what you're intending on how data should be used. If it makes it difficult to do, then you're definitely ahead of the curve, right? That's a sound data security program that you've built out. I would say as well as that final point, I've kind of progressed through the 3 boxes, is continuous learning loops, right? So things like near misses are captured and drive control improvements, right? So not just the metrics that are reported, but then you're taking that information and actually using it to continuously improve the policies that you have in place. I would also say, like the phrase we have in manufacturing, like stop the line. There's like a stop the line culture of like risky data handling, right? So preventing harm before it happens, right? So if you have a culture where employees have a mentality where the phrase comes from like stopping the assembly line if there's a quality or like a safety defect in the production, right? If you're encouraging your users to have that mindset of something is wrong, this isn't right, preventing that, stopping that, reporting it back, and knowing where there are potential issues with your program, then you're ahead of the curve, right? You've done a great job of socializing how data should be handled and what security expectations are. People are empowered and expected to do that. Right? Pause block actions, which they believe could expose data in those scenarios where there could be gaps. And then the final one, which is a great suggestion from my colleague, which we do at Microsoft, security metrics and KPIs built into your annual review. Right? Again, almost forcing users their hand to be part of the team and be part of the process. Like you can't get your full bonus is a little bit extreme if you aren't completing your training, for example, right? A little bit extreme, maybe not that far. Like a part of our core principles, and we ensure that we contribute to the security of Microsoft, right? So one of our core principles as part of our review process is security at Microsoft, right? So we attest to the fact that we're contributing to a more secure Microsoft. It's built into our KPIs or our review process. So again, socializing across your employees, making sure they're part of the solution, not the problem.
Not just attest to it, you need to document what you did to contribute to the security at Microsoft. And you said it's extreme, but it is true at Microsoft. You cannot get your full bonus if you did not measurably contribute to making Microsoft more secure. Every single person, not just the cybersecurity team, not just the security salespeople, everyone has to talk to that. Even the person acting as a building host, sitting at the front desk of a building in Redmond. They can talk to that. They can talk to how they contributed to physical security. Security is shared responsibility.
Well, definitely one of our longer episodes, but there's just so much to talk about when it comes to data security. And, thank you, Amren, for kind of breaking it down for a bunch of these different pillars, because there is a lot involved, from not only just finding out where your data is, but then also what happens when data crosses boundaries, retaining that data, and then just talking about how we can have that culture within a company, which is all part of how data security becomes a successful program at companies.
And not just the hour and a half you just spent with us and all our listeners and viewers educating on and helping you benchmark where you're at, but the prep work to pull this together. It sounds like you socialized this with your team. You got feedback on what they're seeing. So it's not just one person's opinion. This is kind of a data security sales team at Microsoft. What are they seeing as behind the curve, on track, ahead of the curve? And now you have a benchmarking tool. You can listen to this show and be thinking in your head of, gosh, we're hitting a lot of the check marks in the behind the curve box. We need to get to work on our data security. Or better yet, you heard, man, we're ahead of the curve on many, many things. We're doing a great job. Let's keep it up. Let's keep driving these wins. So hopefully it helps you benchmark where you're at and you can set your North Star to where you want to go. And Amren, thank you so much. Always fun to hang out with you and always learn so much from you. Much appreciated.
No, thank you so much, guys, for having me on. Hopefully get to be on again soon as the time.
All right. Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening. As always, our contact information will be in the show notes, as well as I'm going to try to find a way to put Amren's notes into like maybe a GitHub or something like that, so people can go back and refer to it as they listen to the show if you want like a copy, because I think this is going to be super helpful for a lot of people. And so look for that in the show notes. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, just reach out to Adam or myself in the emails that we have in our show notes. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.